All right. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Clark to our Environmental Exchanges seminar here today. Clark Alejandrino is an assistant professor of history at Trinity College, where he teaches Chinese, Pacific, and environmental history. He is most interested in the environmental history of China, especially in climate and animal history. He's currently finishing a book on typhoons and the history of the South China coast, from which this paper is drawn. So today, Clark's giving a paper entitled When the Female Typhoon Mother Transformed into a Male Wind God, a High-Resolution History of Typhoons in Qing China. And feel free to take it away, Clark.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to all the organizers and participants of ANU's Environmental Exchanges seminar. As Ruth mentioned, I'm going to talk about a case study from my book manuscript about how the female typhoon mother became the male wind god, a high-resolution history of typhoons in Qing China. Well, let me start with some questions. Some questions. How do we go from low-resolution climate correlations to high-resolution climate history? What did an uptick in typhoons landing on the southern coast of Qing China during the Yongzheng reign from 1722 to 1735 mean for those affected by these storms? And specifically, how did a village with a local typhoon mother cult gain imperial recognition for their deity in the context of a change in weather? Let me start by telling you what I mean by low resolution and high resolution climate histories. So we all know these kinds of images of temperature change in the last half century of global warming. These are all based on low resolution. These are what we might call low resolution climate models. But ever since over the decades, we've been developing climate models that are based on more factors, that consider more factors that affect local and regional weather. And you can see it on this illustration, how those climate models are becoming more and more sophisticated, developing finer spatial and temporal resolutions across the decades. And this can mean a big difference in how people craft policies to deal with climate change. We get a better sense of how climate change affects people at the local level when we have this kind of high resolution data. And you can see the difference between what a 13-kilometer resolution and a 3-kilometer resolution is. Here are just a few more examples of where the field of climate science is going. And I borrowed this kind of ideas of low resolution and high resolution in climate science, and I use it to characterize how the field of climate history has developed. Just as we started with these low resolution climate models that help show that our climate has been warming over the past half century. Many climate historians have used this low resolution climate data to write these grand narrative books on climate history. These are books that take on large spatial and temporal scales, and they tell grand narratives of the rise and fall of empires. These books tend towards climate determinism. Some of these authors are quite unapologetic about that. John Brooke is unapologetically a climate determinist. I've met him several times. And Jeffrey Parker, if anyone has read Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis, you'll know that the last chapter is entitled, "It's the Climate, Stupid." Of course, there has been some pushback, people who have challenged these grand narratives. Probably the most famous example is Dagmar de Groot's case study of the Little Ice Age of the Dutch Republic during the Little Ice Age, where the stories of catastrophe that permeate Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis book gives way to the flourishing of the Dutch Republic during the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age. Others have taken to smaller spatial temporal frames in order to tell very fine-grained histories of climate. examples are Mark Carey's In the Shadow of Melting Glaciers. It tells the story of how melting glaciers in our age of global warming is changing the lives of people in the Andes Mountains who have lived with these glaciers for centuries. My colleague here at Trinity College, Tom Wickman, has written Snowshoe Country, an environmental cultural history of winter in the early American Northeast. And these finer spatial temporal frames allows them to examine climate in relation to local society and culture. This, I have to reiterate, is a kind of typical dynamic conversation. It's common to all fields of history, this tension between macro and micro histories, global versus regional versus national versus local history. And these kinds of higher resolution climate histories are better at highlighting human agency in the face of climate change. And certainly that's important for us as we face this climate crisis. We need more stories about how humans are able to deal with climate changes in the past. Some of this pushback against grand narratives that are typically climate deterministic have crystallized in the form of new fields within the climate history. The publication 2021 of this article can be considered to be the birth date of the field of HCS, or the history of climate in society, an attempt to understand climate change in history that goes beyond simple correlations. And of course, people who have been who are asking that we pay more attention to culture, climate, culture, and history, emphasis on how climate change is refracted through all kinds of human dimensions and institutions. And in fact, Whitehorse Press is publishing a new journal this year called Climates and Cultures in History. Now, what does this, what do these developments have to do with the study of climate history in Asia, in particular China, which is my field? Well, let me start with Ellsworth Huntington's famous Pulse of Asia, published in 1907, where he made correlations between cycles of cold climate, which send pulses of nomadic invasions from the heart of Central Asia to disturb the major empires around on the coastlines of the Eurasian continent. And climate people like Zhuge Chen in China in 1972 also took an interest in finding the role of climate in history, understanding the role of climate history in a very seminal study in 1972 of climate change in the past 5,000 years of Chinese history, though Zhuge Chen made it clear it's a very preliminary study, 初步研究. He also attempted to look for ways in which climate changes between warm and cold cycles correlated with the dynastic cycles of Chinese history. Just Brett Hinch in 1988 also published something similar, Climatic Change and History in China, though it was published at a time of very little data and very little attention for climate history. So it was published without much fanfare or attention given to it. But in the past 2 decades, as historical climatology has become more and more important, as we become more aware of our climate crisis, and more scientists and historians take to the field, we have more studies that attempt to understand climate history from the point of view of climate change. One of the most prominent historical climatologists publishing in the field is David D. Zhang and his collaborators in Hong Kong. And some of these studies are very famous and influential in the field. They make correlations between climate change, wars, and dynastic cycles in China. You can see the kinds of tables here that correlate the rise of dynasties with warm phases and warm or cold phases and their collapse as well. Most recently in 2014, the Pulse of Imperial China was published by David D. Zhang, which kind of harkens back to Ellsworth Huntington's The Pulse of Asia. And I call this Huntington Redux. Of course, China historians, these are that's the work of historical climatologists, and China historians have taken to these studies with skepticism. So Ian Anderson, for example, has published and written a lot of criticism of these studies and questioned how these studies can too simply explain the rise and fall of China's dynasties. There are historical climatologists within China, like Zhu Kezhen, who wrote this magisterial book explaining Chinese history through climate change, but he was very conscious of being accused of being a climate determinist. So a lot of the conclusions in the book are not really conclusions. They're often stated in words such as possible or may or maybe. Instead of climate determinism, I call this climate maybeism. But the problem with climate maybeism is you can't really make any definitive conclusions if they're all couched in maybe or possible. Also, some people have also looked at the Little Ice Age in Chinese history. A century, the 17th century was when the Ming Dynasty fell, and Ming historians have criticized how historical climatologists too readily explain the fall of the Ming through climate change. I personally don't know any Ming historian, self-respecting Ming historian, who would endorse a monocausal climate explanation for the fall of the Ming. Of course, some historians have taken to climate history in China. Tim Brooke probably is the most famous and recent example. His book, The Troubled Empire, which puts the Yuan and the Ming together within the arc of the Little Ice Age, attempts to emphasize local weather and the ways in which pressures of weather in society shape Yuan and Ming history. I guess the problem is that in this general textbook, he tries to tackle the entire Ming Empire, which leads to very diffuse and unsystematic treatment of the influence of climate and weather in society. More and more people are looking at what we might call the cultural turn of climate history. Here's a recent kind of survey of the field by Fiona Williamson. And today what I want to do is give an example of what I think is what I would like to see, which is more high resolution climate histories of China, which there aren't really any. And so I'm going to do this by examining very closely a case study of typhoons in the history of the South China coast in order to illustrate how to do high resolution climate, to go from a low resolution climate data to high resolution climate history. Well, first of all, these are the typhoon spaces of coastal China. So these are the parts of China's coasts which are vulnerable to typhoons. I am going to participate. There are these typhoons from the Pacific, the South China Sea, typically either go to the East China coast, you can see it here, or the South China coast. And I don't have time to go into the details of this, but the South China coast tends to get more typhoons than the East China coast for reasons I don't have the time to explain. One easy way of understanding this is, one reason is that this area of China receives typhoons not only from the South China Sea, but also from the Pacific, whereas this part of China only receives typhoons that emerge here. Now, let me start with this graph. This is a graph from one of the better studies of typhoon reconstruction studies of Qing China, which was published in 2014. I have taken the graph on South China landing typhoons, and these blue bars are temperatures. What we need to focus on here is this line. This is a line indicating the number of typhoons that made landfall on the South China coast. And what I'd like to draw your attention to this peak over here, around 1730. You can see that from around 1710 here up to 1730 something, there was a very noticeable peak in typhoon landfalls in the South China coast. So what does it mean? What does it mean that there's a peak? There's an noticeable increase of typhoons landing on the South China coast in the Yongzheng. This coincides with the Yongzheng reign, 1722, 1735. What does it mean? Here's a map of the Qing Empire, and this is the area where these typhoons are landing more frequently between 1710 and 1730. This increase in typhoon landfalls was actually noticed by the Qing Emperor Yongzheng. We know this because I found these memorials in the National Palace. This memorial in the National Palace Museum of Taipei. It was written by the Governor General and the Governor of the Guangdong province, and it's reporting the circumstances in which three prefectures of Guangdong, Gaozhou, Leizhou, Chongzhou, were struck by a typhoon and sustained losses, and how your humble servants delegated personnel to provide relief. Now, typically in these memorials, the emperor will read it and then write comments in vermilion ink. And you can see the emperor's comments written here in vermilion ink. I took a photo of it. I found this in the Taiwan's National Palace Museum. And this gives us an idea to what the emperor was thinking and how he plans to deal with this problem. And here I translate for you the emperor's vermilion comments. In recent years, I feel the typhoon disasters have worsened. You officials should assess the capabilities of the area to build several shrines to the wind god. Try and see, for maybe we can invite the protection of the divine. You never know. I leave it up to your discretion in handling this. So the Yongzheng Emperor saw a problem with, noticed this increase in typhoons. It was reported up to him by his local officials, regional officials, and though it's not the focus of my talk, Qing disaster relief was sent, but here we see in his comments, he's also recommending a specific ritual solution to the problem. The creation of temples to a deity called the wind god as a way of minimizing or maybe perhaps preventing typhoons from coming again. Now, it just so happened that during the Yongzheng reign, the Yongzheng Emperor had started building a series of temples in the capital, Beijing. These are among these many temples, 4 of them are to weather gods, the 4 weather gods of Beijing: the wind god, the thunder god, the cloud god, and the rain god. And here I've mapped out for you the locations within just around the Forbidden City. So this is the Forbidden City, this is the moat, and you can see the temples of these 4 gods are just outside of the Forbidden City. And the wind god that we're concerned with has his temple right over here. We know when it was built. It was built in 1728. The other temples, 3 of the 4 temples were built in the Yongzheng reign. Only one of them, the rain god's temple, was already there during the Shunzhi reign, or early on in the establishment of the dynasty. So the point is that all of these other 3 temples were built in the Yongzheng reign. This is what the wind god temple looks like right now. It's just an office. There's no wind god in it anymore, but there's a sign that tells you this is where the wind god temple used to be, and this is a picture I took. Now, why was the Yongzheng Emperor building these temples? Well, from what we know from existing literature, the Yongzheng Emperor was very famous as a reformer, indefatigable, tireless, trying to bring a sense of order and standards and prosperity back to the Qing after the long and semi-wasteful rule of his father, the Kangxi Emperor. He was also known to have been active in trying to standardize. So we have this book, for example, by Madeleine Zellin, Magistrate's Tile, which details the history of Yongzheng's fiscal reforms. But we also know that in the ritual arena, the Yongzheng Emperor was also active in promoting imperial orthodoxy, especially in terms, for example, of female chastity, the promotion of examples of chaste women, and the building of temples and memorial arches to these women. You can read this in Janet Tice's book, Disgraceful Matters. And we also know that the Yongzheng Emperor articulated a new kind of moral meteorology, wherein local bad weather was not blamed on the emperor in Beijing, but was blamed on the local officials where in the area where the bad weather occurred. And yeah, Mark Elvin actually used to teach at ANU. So going back to the Emperor's Vermilion comments, what we see here is the Emperor's attempt to intention to promote a god that he had just elevated in the center in Beijing and promote it to the frontier, to the coast. And also it's an example as well of his moral meteorology, which is placing the consequences of local weather in the hands of local officials. After that suggestion to make wind god temples, we see in the local gazetteers, I have in mind these local gazetteers looking for dates, reports of wind god temples being built, and these are what I've found. Several counties in the southern coast in the province of Guangdong start building wind god temples from 1734 to 1733 to 1736. This is an image of the prefectures, the coastal prefectures. Many of them were host to these wind god temples. But all of them have managed not to survive to the present day. Instead, only one wind god temple still exists today, and you can find it in Leizhou Peninsula. So this is the map of Guangdong province on the South China coast, and this is this small peninsula jutting out called Leizhou. And the lone wind god temple that exists today in China, in southern China, is the one that's on Leizhou Peninsula. I have also, so the capital of that prefecture at that time was Leizhou City over here. And here you can look at the map I cut from Google Maps. This is Leizhou City. There's a temple here called the Dongyue Temple, which is actually where the wind god temple is found. They're twin temples. This is the Dongyue Temple over here. Here's the wind god temple built right beside it. So what happened was I realized that I needed to do anthropological fieldwork. I needed to go to this place, to the villages that were home to these temples, and actually talk to the people and and do research there. And this is something that's not uncommon in Chinese social history. There's a school of historical anthropology in the Chinese history field called the South China School of Historical Anthropology, also known in Chinese as Huanan Xuepai. And learning from their example, I traveled to the villages here in 2016. Leizhou, this peninsula is, of course, vulnerable to typhoons. One of the most recent super typhoons to hit it was Mangkhut in 2018. For centuries, people in Leizhou had to deal with typhoons. As the population of Leizhou grew in the 15th and 16th centuries, people expanded farmland and started reclaiming land from the ocean to create agricultural fields. The Leizhou people and the local gazetteers refer to these as ocean fields, Yangtian, Yang being ocean, indicating that these are lands reclaimed from the ocean. They built dikes in order to do that, and you can still see this is Leizhou City over here, and you can see here the ocean fields, and you can see the contours of dikes. Here's the coastline. That's the South China Sea. You can imagine a typhoon hitting straight, coming from the South China Sea from the Pacific, and slamming straight into the Leizhou Peninsula and inundating the fields that are essential to the economy and life of the people living in Leizhou. So Leizhou developed many ways of dealing with typhoons. Many methods were of predicting typhoons, of handling typhoons, and these were documented in local gazetteers. This is a page, 2 pages from the provincial gazetteer of Guangdong in 1822, and it tells you that there are many ways to predict typhoons in Leizhou. And we're told that in Leizhou, there is a typhoon altar, where offerings are made every year on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, known in Chinese as Tuanu, the Tuanu festival. We are also told that the typhoon altar hosts a deity known as the Typhoon Mother, Jumu. The original location of the typhoon altar is here. This blue dot over here, which I made, is where the original typhoon altar was located. It's sitting on top of a dike that was built in the Kangxi reign. And it was literally at the forefront of the defense against typhoons. Like it was the first thing, one of the first things that a typhoon would encounter as it crashed into Leizhou Peninsula. And it was built, the first typhoon altar was built by a prefect named Hongfu in the Ming Dynasty. And we know that that date was 1538, which is the 17th year of the Qing Emperor's reign. Today, there's only a very small temple. I wouldn't even call it a temple, but a small place that houses a plaque to a deity that still has something to do with typhoons. But it's no longer as important as the wind god that I'm about to tell you about. So what is the Typhoon Mother that is being worshipped at this typhoon altar? Well, the earliest mention of the Typhoon Mother goes to the 9th or the 10th century in the Tang Dynasty. People traveling to the South China coast, which was still very much a frontier area, talked about typhoons and talked about how locals used a certain omen called the Typhoon Mother to tell when a typhoon was about to arrive. And supposedly this was an omen that was used by mariners, most likely non-Chinese mariners. And we're told that this is an omen that looks something like a rainbow. By the Song Dynasty, it was this Typhoon Mother omen was described as a combination of rainbows, half rainbows, broken rainbows, and red clouds. And to be able to see this in the ocean outside up in the air in the ocean meant that typhoon was coming. This is not entirely unscientific because typhoons are characterized by low barometric pressure and also a higher amount of moisture in the atmosphere. These are conditions that are ideal for refracting the colors of yellow, red, and orange in the light spectrum. So seeing red clouds in the sky is actually not a bad way of predicting that a typhoon may come. By the late imperial period, it's very clear that this Typhoon Mother omen, was not just simply an omen, but it was already being considered like a spirit or as a deity. In fact, a very prolific Qing writer, 17th century author Qi Daqin, talks about how the typhoon of the Typhoon Mother in a way that makes it sound anthropomorphic. He talks about the Typhoon Mother first taking the form of a double rainbow, then incubating the wind inside its womb. And after 4 or 5 days, the typhoon is unleashed from that womb. And according to Qi, the longer the wind incubates, then the more explosive it will be when unleashed, which is not a bad description of typhoons. We know that the longer they linger in warm waters in the ocean, the more powerful they can be. And the Typhoon altar had its ceremonies to the typhoon, rituals to the Typhoon Mother on the lunar 5th day, 5th month, 5th day of the 5th month. So I call it lunar 5/5. Now this is something that in in South China is a festival that's common, particularly in many places in South China. Lunar 5/5 was a day when they would send off the plague gods before the summer, when diseases were more likely to be virulent. So this is an image of plague gods, what Chinese call Wunshen. And Tuanujie, or the lunar 5/5, was the day when you sent off these plague gods, Songzhou Wunshen. Here's an example from Taiwan. This is on lunar 5/5. They would send off the plague gods by putting them on boats and putting the boats to sea and burning the boats. There's a great book by Paul Katz about this, Devil Hordes and Burning Boats. In Leizhou Peninsula, during the Ming and the early Qing period, it turns out that there weren't a lot of epidemics. Epidemics didn't plague Leizhou Peninsula based on Tana Lee's study, and they didn't plague Leizhou as much as they would in the 19th century when bubonic plague ravaged the peninsula, as one of my advisors at Georgetown, Carl Benedict, has documented. Instead, the greatest I know there are no such thing as natural disasters, but the greatest threat from nature to the peninsula were typhoons. And instead of sending off plague spirits, plague gods, what they wanted to ward off were typhoons. And so it's not surprising that the typhoon altar hosted rituals on lunar 5/5, a day when plague prophylaxis was common in other parts of South China, was a day for typhoon prophylaxis in Leizhou Peninsula. And you can also see how they're even comparing practices on Leizhou Peninsula with those happening in neighboring Hainan Island, where there was a considerable indigenous population, the Li people, who had their own typhoon spirits. And this Han Chinese author of the gazetteer is being condescending when he says that the Li people worship the typhoon spirit only after the typhoon has already occurred, whereas in Leizhou, what they do is they worship the Typhoon Mother before typhoon season occurs. So he's saying that their practice of worshiping the Typhoon Mother before typhoons come and preventing typhoons from happening is superior to the Li people, who only worship their god after the typhoon's already there. Now, the typhoon altar was moved several times. I won't go into detail about this, but it was moved from from its original location, 1538, was moved to another location, 1546, and finally moved to the north of the city in 1554. This was after a devastating typhoon in 1552, which is documented in the prefectural gazetteer of Leizhou in 1614. And here's a map from the Qing gazetteer, where we can see this is where the typhoon altar stands outside of the northern gates of the Leizhou city, which is exactly where you find the wind god temple today, north of Leizhou as well, here in this modern map. The rituals that occurred on lunar 5/5, we are told when I visited there, the villagers told me that they had a tradition of putting out kites shaped like birds of prey to ward off typhoons. They claim that they've been doing this since 1538. And you can see here a picture I took of the kite festival as it was happening in June 9 of 2016, which is 5/5. And here is this is a promotional material where they're telling the story of the origins of the kite festival of Leizhou. Now, printed on the promotional material is this. We are told that the kite festival has been passed down, indicating that this is oral history. I have not found any kind of written documents containing the information I'm sharing with you right now. These are all printed on the promotional material. We're told that the kite festival has been passed down since Ming times, that one night the wind god appeared to Prefect Hong Fu in a dream and said, "You ought to make kites in the form of various birds of prey. Send them high up into the sky, and together they will hunt and kill rats and typhoons." Rats, of course, bringers of epidemics, and they ravage granaries and typhoons, and it will surely succeed. So the wind god supposedly appeared to the prefect who was the one who made the typhoon altar. And here is a picture of the wind god of Leizhou. Now, the problem is there's no Ming text which talks about the wind god. We only have a Typhoon Mother for the Ming period text. And the wind god only really appears in the region in the 1730s as a result of the Yongzheng Emperor's decree, suggestion that the officials build wind god temples. And Qing, it's only in the Qing gazetteers that we start to see mention of the wind god in Leizhou. So for the Leizhou Prefectural Gazetteer for 1811, for example, we are told that the wind god temple is outside the north gate of the Leizhou city walls, which is exactly where the typhoon altar was located. There is the temple itself has a stele. Here's a picture of it that I took. It's called, what's it called? It's called A Record of the Rebuilding of the Wind God Temple, which occurred sometime in the 19th century. And we are told, when I look for any mention of the origins of the Wind God Temple, what we see is this. The date when the Wind God Temple was first built cannot be traced or cannot be ascertained. During the Kite Festival, I was looking at the material and I was talking to people, and here is what they say about the origins of the Wind God Temple. Leizhou's Wind God Temple originated in the 17th year of the Jia reign. That's 1538. That's the date when the Typhoon altar was created in the Ming Dynasty. The earliest site was called the Typhoon altar. And then we're told the Wind God Temple has moved twice. So obviously, these promotional materials, the way that the locals remember their history, they're conflating the Typhoon altar and the Wind God Temple, and they're thus conflating the Typhoon Mother with the Wind God. When I questioned the villagers, my informants, when I asked them directly the question, what is the relationship between the Typhoon Mother and the Wind God? Here are the answers can be boiled down to these two. I would be told that the Typhoon Mother is the Wind God, or that the Typhoon Mother is an avatar of the Wind God, or a manifestation of the Wind God. Here's the way I read the history of what has happened. There was a local Typhoon Mother cult in Leizhou, established in the mid-16th century, that performed prophylactic typhoon rituals to the deity on lunar 5/5. In 1733, the Yongzheng Emperor, because of a perception of the rise in typhoon landfalls off the southern coast, orders the building of wind god temples. I think what happened is that the locals took the opportunity to obtain imperial recognition for their Typhoon Mother, readily substituting her with the male wind god as their typhoon prophylactic functions also coincided. The wind god was then spoken, and I say spoken here because this is not written into history. It was spoken back into local history and made to appear as having been there already since 1538, when he appeared in a dream to the prefect Hong Fu, who erected the first typhoon altar. This dream does not appear in any Ming or Qing text. This is something the locals told me and is printed on their promotional materials. We know that the Qing, when the wind god temples were established, the Yongzheng Emperor suggested that offerings be made to the wind god in spring and autumn, right here, Chun Chou. The god was also referred to as the god that spreads benevolence and illuminates happiness, Shen Ren Zhao Tai. Look at the statue of the wind god in Leizhou. You can see here. The Qing title is here on the plaque. Shen Ren Zhao Tai. Shen Ren, of course, is the same, or spreading benevolence is the same title of the wind god temple in Beijing. We also have documentary evidence of this. I found in the first historical archives, the Leizhou in Beijing, this memorial from the Governor General and the Governor of Guangdong in the last year, the Yongzheng era, from Emita and Yang Yongpin. It's a memorial requesting for a plaque to be bestowed for the Wind God Temple. And the title, the Shenren title is there, and we're told in this memorial that this title is going to be bestowed to the Wind God temples in the south. Oh, sorry. So even though the Qing Emperor Yongzheng had prescribed that rituals be performed in spring and autumn, then locals never followed that recommendation. Instead, they continued to perform rituals to the wind god on lunar 5/5, which is the Ming practice. This is just another dimension of the Ming Typhoon Mother and the Qing wind gods combining into one hybrid deity. Here, I want to show you the procession that I witnessed on June 9, 2016. So that is a video of the wind god being taken from the place where he's normally seated in the temple, and he's being taken out on a procession. This is a very common, this is a very common thing that you find in local region China, this procession, or what the Chinese call Youshen. And let me just show a few parts of this video. So you can see the wind god being taken out of the temple into the streets. Oh, sorry. So that's the wind god on a sedan chair being taken out by local people to survey the villages that fall under his jurisdiction. So here are some. So I followed the god where it was a tiring day. We walked several miles. The wind god surveyed villages. You can see here that children in the village paying a homage to the wind god. He's taken out into the modern streets of Leizhou, you can see here. And he's finally taken to this large clearing, open space, where the kite festival is taking place. And you can see a couple of his friends, gods from nearby temples. The Dongyue temple, the two gods in the Dongyue temple came out, and another god from a neighboring village came out as well to join the wind god temple to watch and enjoy the kite festival. This is a picture of the wind god temple right here. You can see the plantain fan that he carries, and he's there watching the kite festival occur. And in a final twist, if you look at the temple walls, you will see that the wind god temple The Kite Festival has been declared an intangible heritage, 非物质文化, a status that's granted to them in 2012. This is a common strategy in many parts of China during a period of post-Mao religious revival. This was a way in which local communities could gain state recognition for their local religions, and even gain some measure of financial support as well. Just another example, albeit a 21st century version of how locals obtain state recognition for their local cult. So how do we tell a high-resolution history of this particular climate data? Well, to conclude, an increase in typhoons landing in South China between 1710 to 1730 was noticed by the Yongzheng Emperor as officials reported typhoon disasters to Beijing. The emperor responded by sending the usual and well-known disaster relief and ordering the promotion of the wind god, a newly imperially sponsored deity in Beijing, to the southern coast. Locals in Leizhou used the opportunity to obtain imperial recognition for their local Typhoon Mother cult from the Ming, readily interchanging the female Ming deity with the male Qing deity. The locals then retold their history to place the wind god in it as early as 1538. Ming practices such as processions, kite festivals, and lunar 5/5 also took precedence over Qing prescriptions. In the 21st century, the locals displayed once again their ability to utilize particular circumstances, the spread of the concept of intangible heritage, to once again obtain state recognition for their local practice. Through the combination of various genres of documentary sources in conjunction with anthropological fieldwork, here is one high-resolution history of typhoons in Qing China. Thank you.
Thank you.